Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this third GCI Talks webinar. We are expecting a large crowd today, nearly 70 people. And while we wait for people to join, we'd love it if you could put into chat where you're joining us from. And we know that many of you are connected to GCI in some way. We've got fellows, alumni, mentors, parents, friends, and supporters of GCI. Tell us your connection to GCI if you could. So again, while we wait for the next 20 seconds or so for people to join, tell us where you're joining from. And if you have a connection to GCI, we'd love to know about that. We've got Masa from Japan. Hello to you. Mount Laurel, New Jersey, San Juan, Puerto Rico. Another individual from Puerto Rico. One from Tokyo, Japan. We have a nice Japan contingent. Boston, Massachusetts, from one of our teacher participants and a good colleague, Jordan, joining as well. Again, thank you. Welcome, everyone. Good morning if you're in the eastern part of the U.S. Good evening if you're in Asia. And we will get underway in just a second. If you could tell us in the chat where you're joining us from, and if you have a connection to GCI, we would love to hear that. We have someone from California, Connecticut, Greenwich, Connecticut. I know that individual well. Thank you, everyone, for joining again this morning. Again, we're expecting about 70 people to log in. Well, once again, good morning, and thank you for joining the Global Citizens Initiative GCI Talks webinar. GCI Talks is a series of conversations of topics of deep relevance to GCI's mission, including education, ethics, and global leadership. Today's webinar is being recorded and is on the record, and this is the third webinar that we've done. I'm David James, Executive Director of GCI, and for those who don't know, GCI is a Connecticut-based 501c3 nonprofit social impact organization that engages, educates, and empowers the next generation to become lifelong leaders of positive change. Through our signature programs that work directly with students and teachers and schools, we provide the educational tools and ongoing support to equip secondary school students with the mindset, skills, and resources to become thoughtful, committed, and ethical global citizens and leaders. And since 2014, we've impacted over 200 students and 36 educators from over 70 countries. And we hope those of you on the webinar today will consider joining one of our programs. Today's webinar is titled Leading Global Innovation, and we are so honored to have Dr. Linda Hill with us today. She is the Wallace Brett Dunham Professor of Business Administration at the Harvard Business School and Chair of the Leadership Initiative. Her bio is in the chat, and she's regarded as one of the top experts on leadership and innovation. Here at GCI, we are also so honored and proud to have her as one of the members of our board. So thank you for that. And before I turn the floor over to her, I also want to thank all of my colleagues at GCI. Everyone plays a role in putting this event together, and many of them are behind the scenes today, and thank you so much for that. Linda's going to give a bit of a presentation. We'll have a little bit of a dialogue, and then we'd like all of you in the audience to feel free to ask questions. You can ask questions at any time, and we'll get to them later on. Prefer that you ask them in the Q&A section of Zoom, but you can also ask them in chat if that's easier for you. So thank you so much for joining. Linda, thank you for being with us.
Well, what a privilege to be here and speak to the GCI family and friends of the family. We have to celebrate all that this organization has been able to do. I will say we all have to celebrate, because when I meet the young people who work with the organization and the teachers, I am moved and really, really inspired to think about what I should be doing differently at Harvard Business School to make sure we are developing leaders who will make a difference in the world, and a positive difference. I guess we want to make sure we say that. So what I do want to do is, in maybe 15 minutes or so, 18 minutes, share with you research I've been doing for over 20 years. And I will tell you about, I collaborate with a number of individuals on this research, always with a young person. When they start with me, they're usually about 21, 22, and they're full co-authors of the books that we end up writing, and also with people who are in practice, who actually do this stuff and not simply teach it. So I'm looking forward to your questions and your insights. And let me just begin by sharing some slides with you and walking through the basic model or pieces of the model. And what I'm actually going to be sharing with you is really some of the cases we've been working on for the new book, which is called Scaling Genius. So just give me a moment to get the screen up. properly, make sure I'm sharing what I need to and that everybody can see it. So, David, is that working?
It is starting to share, and now it is.
Okay,
Yep, you're good.
I'm good. So I study leadership, innovation, and globalization, and it turns out that the academy is rather siloed. And although we know a lot about leadership and we know a lot about innovation, we actually don't know a whole lot about the connection between the two because we don't study the connection between the two. I'm actually an ethnographer, an organizational anthropologist. So what I do is look at leaders in context, and I try to follow them as they work with their colleagues over time, usually for a minimum of 5 years. I will tell you, COVID made it hard for someone like me who is an anthropologist, but then I learned how to use all of these various virtual tools and actually was able to observe even more maybe than just being able to visit, as I've had to do in other instances before we actually did learn to use these tools more regularly. So my research is mostly qualitative, although it definitely has quantitative basis too, for those of you who like to make sure what are the numbers and how does this all work. But I do want to just share with you my thoughts about some of what we've learned over time. The new book we think is going to be called Scaling Genius, but I have to tell you the publisher gets to choose your title, so I don't know if it will be called that or not. But we've been collecting data for a number of years on organizations in a whole range of countries. Now, these are the countries where the leaders that we have studied, where the headquarters are of the companies of the leaders we have studied. Some of the leaders have been in other countries, but always we know that the headquarters of a company or an organization really does impact kind of the culture and capabilities of that organization and what the leader is working with. I also want to tell you that we've mostly studied business organizations, but we have studied government a fair amount and not-for-profit organizations. And what we see is, I will talk with you, one of the things that we're writing about in this book is that leaders need to be able to work across the sectors to actually get done what they want to get done to innovate on behalf of fulfilling their purpose. So when we look at leaders in all these different contexts, I will tell you that there are indeed differences. But I'm not going to talk a whole lot about that. The differences relate to, we think, cultural differences or national differences, and also differences in individual style. But there also are lots of commonalities, and that is what I want to speak to you about. The first thing I want to tell you about these leaders is they adopt a very, very simple definition of innovation. Very simple. An innovation is anything that is new and useful to the organization. And very specifically to that organization. Some other organization may have it and been doing it for a while, but we haven't. So new and useful, it can be a product, a service, a new business model, a way of organizing, a way of cutting costs, a way of packaging, whatever it is. And a lot of the innovation is incremental, but all of the organizations we have studied have done breakthrough innovation. So for sure, these leaders want everyone to know that they have a role to play in innovation. So what they want is that everyone in the organization, in our language, can be both a value creator and a game changer. A value creator is someone who knows how to identify and close what are called performance gaps, gaps between where we are now and where we should be. A game changer is someone who knows how to identify and close what are referred to as opportunity gaps, a gap between where we are now and where we could be. So what you see in these organizations is everyone is told, you got to be a value creator, you got to be a game changer. Now, innovation will be required to close an opportunity gap, almost for sure. It may or may not be required to close a performance gap, but often it is. So for sure, we have to worry about both of these, and I'll talk about how this plays out as we move forward. I want to check, David, am I speaking too quickly?
No, you are perfect, Linda.
Okay, so let me know, because I know we have a global audience, and I don't know how people, I know mostly English, but a lot of you are bilingual, trilingual, etc. But let me know and give us a signal if I'm going too fast. Now, when you have in your organization people understanding you're supposed to do both, not just what I should do, but what I could do for the customer. And so what you see in these organizations is they have more individuals who fall into box one. Box one, you don't, maybe you will have people who are mostly in roles where it's mostly game changing and they're doing a lot of two. And you may have people who are mostly in roles that, are mostly value creators. But what you want to have happen over time is that you have people who know how to do both. One of the organizations we had the privilege of studying, or one of the leaders, was the leader who was the head of innovation R&D for Procter & Gamble. And one of the things she said is people came to Procter & Gamble because they wanted to be able to be game changers, And then they discovered after they were there for a while that they actually kind of got punished for some of that, because when you go after a could, you know, you may have a misstep. You may not get it quite right. It might take longer to get it done than you thought. And she said over time, what happened to the organization is people became fours. Again, you want fours because we have to deliver. And if you're in a private company, you've got to deliver for the market and pay attention to the present. But what happened as a result of that is they weren't growing the way they needed to grow. So she ended up putting in place a program to innovate on how they innovated, and looking at a whole lot of factors that were impacting why it was that people came with the passion, had all kinds of ideas about coulds, but over time had sort of learned from the organization that I'm only supposed to do a should. Now, when you do that, you cannot build an organization that is agile, that can innovate time and again. And that's what we all need to do in the kind of environment, doesn't matter what sector you're in these days. So what you see in these organizations over time is that these leaders understand that innovation or leading innovation is not so much about getting people to follow you to the future, like you have the vision, follow me. It's actually much more about how do I create an environment in which people will be willing and able to co-create with me and co-create that future. And co-creation is different than followership, a very different paradigm of leadership. And what you see here, and I want to be clear that all of the leaders that we have studied, they've all been visionaries, sometimes real big time visionaries, but they get that they have to manage themselves in a way that they don't take up all the space, which is one of the things that I was told when I had the privilege of studying President Mandela and some of the people who were with him in prison. Even though he could take up all the space, he knew that wasn't good enough. He had to make space for others and create that environment that would help the other people around him be willing and able to do what was necessary to create the new South Africa. So there are three muscles that we see get built in these organizations that allow them to co-create. And co-creation has three parts to it: collaboration, experimentation, and learning. So innovation does not happen from some individual having an aha experience. And one of the organizations I studied for many, many years was Pixar, one of Steve Jobs' organizations. And believe me, they had individual geniuses. But Steve Jobs understood it was a collective activity, and they worked on these muscles. Of course, they had their own words for them. The first muscle is creative abrasion. This is, can we create a marketplace of ideas through debate and discourse? A marketplace of ideas, a competition of ideas. Do we know how to listen to each other? Do we know how to ask questions and encourage people to develop their ideas? But do we also know how to advocate for our point of view? Because it's a competition of ideas. There's a reason why we support marketplaces. So what you need to do as a leader is work on building the environment in which people will be willing to really take on and have that good fight. So that's creative abrasion. So you create a robust pipeline of ideas to actually work on. And that goes beyond brainstorming, where anything goes and everything goes. When you actually begin to rub the ideas, a lot of people don't like the word abrasion, but we use it intentionally. Now, creative agility is about, can you actually experiment and learn? So you cannot plan your way to an innovation. You do as much planning as you can, and there is a discipline about all of that. But in the end, you're going to have to experiment. And the real key is, can you experiment quickly and efficiently, not spend too much money doing it, not too much time, not too much resource, so that you can get those learning cycles up and get to a solution that is more innovative. And that is what actually Procter & Gamble did. They started with creative agility. When I look at large organizations, most of them start with creative agility. And methods like that, for those of you who know this language, would be lean startup, agile methodologies, design thinking. Those are all ways for us to actually experiment with, if you will, the customer and do it quickly and efficiently over time. So that's creative agility. Now, the last one, creative resolution, is about how we make decisions. So what we know is you rarely get innovation without diversity of thought and diversity of expertise. Now, diversity of thought is different from demographic diversity, but demographic diversity does often lead to more diversity of thought. And this is something that I think is really important about what GCI does, helping people learn how to deal with diversity of thought in a constructive way. So creative resolution is, we know we have to have a patient and inclusive way of hearing different voices. So creative abrasion kind of helps us with that. And we also need to be able to take advantage of the learning that has come from creative agility. So if we're going to do that, it has to be a more patient and inclusive way of decision making. But guess what? the decision-making rights need to be very clear. Everyone needs to know who in the end is going to make the decision. You need that structure. Otherwise, we go round and around, we never stop. The other piece of it is that you don't let one group dominate. You don't let the bosses dominate. And Steve Jobs used to worry a whole lot about letting the experts dominate, because the experts are very tied to the current state of affairs. That's what their expertise is about. Now, the last piece of it is you don't go along to get along. You don't simply compromise. And we all know that compromise rarely leads to, if you will, a more cutting edge kind of solution. So what you see in these organizations, you have patient and inclusive, real clear decision-making rights. And in the end, what we're trying to do is do more both and kind of decision-making as opposed to either or. Can we take the best of what we've learned, the best of what we heard, and put it together in a new and different way that will help our organization fulfill its purpose? Now, I'm going to show you this slide, but I'll say one thing about this slide. One of the things, if those muscles are what make you able to co-create together, what makes you willing to is your culture. And the only thing I want to point out about this slide is that what we see is in organizations that are very innovative, they have a clear sense of shared purpose. You need that sense of shared purpose for a range of reasons that I'll describe when I go through a couple examples. But without that sense that I'm a part of a community, you know what? I don't feel psychologically safe to really do and take on the emotionally and intellectually difficult work of innovation. I mean, why should I do it? Something I could be harmed, if you will. The other part of it, of course, is it really worth it? So the purpose has to be bold enough and linked to my own passions for me to think, this is something I want to do. So that purpose piece is so critical, and that is why we see so many books, I think, these days being written about purpose, because without it, it's really, really hard to get people to be willing to do the hard work associated with innovation. So when you get this all right, and I want to just actually say one thing about it that let me go back to this slide for just a minute. So what I want to say about this capability is what makes you able, what makes you willing. What you're really trying to do is create an environment in which you are unleashing the slices of genius in your organization. And this is terminology I got from my co-author, who is the Chief Technology Officer of Pixar. What they say at Pixar is that everybody has a slice of genius. Everybody has talents, everybody has passions. And you as a leader have to figure out how to amplify and unleash those slices of genius. And therefore, make sure we're using all the resource in the organization. Now, not only do you need to unleash to get the new ideas, but then you're going to have to leverage and harness them to make sure they're useful. And to do that, you're going to have to kind of take people with your own behavior, your own leadership behavior from this unleashing side, which is really about creating the psychological safety for that to happen. But then you got to work it through, and there's going to be conflict. If you think about Pixar and who's there are a lot of people very talented and passionate. They're not going to back down very quickly. You've got to be able to figure out how do we work through that creative abrasion and move over to that leverage and harnessing side. And so this is what's going on, and you as an individual are using yourself as an instrument to try to create the culture and capabilities necessary. Now, I don't want you to absorb all of this, but I want to tell you what it is a little bit and why I'm showing it to you. So one of the leaders that we studied was a man named Michael Koo. And many of you have been touched, or all of us in some ways have been touched by the work of Michael Koo and his team, because his team is the team that ran the Pfizer trials in 266 days and made the impossible possible. And I'm sure many of you have Pfizer, you have the vaccine from Pfizer coursing through your bodies. So we didn't know that COVID was going to happen, and I began to study his team in 2016. And what you see here is data that describes sort of the culture and capabilities of their organization with a quantitative method we have for looking at these things. What you will see is Michael came in, and he actually was brought in to do a digital transformation of the global clinical supply chain, the people who run the trials. And he first had to convince them that they were supposed to be innovators. They didn't think they were supposed to be innovators. The scientists were the innovators, maybe some of the tech people in digital, but not me working in packaging and manufacturing. He had to convince them all that, yes, indeed, they were all supposed to innovate on behalf of delivering their purpose, which they began to define as delivering hope to the patient. So one of the things that he discovered is even though these people worked at Pfizer, and many of them had been there over 20 years, there wasn't this sense of community or shared purpose. about, you know what is it? So they did a lot of stuff that I won't have time to talk to you about right now to create that sense of shared purpose. It took them about 1.5 years to get everybody on board with that. So you see that as deep green, and that's good. And then lighter green is, not quite as good. Yellow is in the middle, and red is a bit of a problem. Now, if you look at his leadership team, I'm not going to say much more about it. You see that that's actually, I want to tell you that looks good. We've used this instrument in about 160 organizations. And when you look like that as your senior team, that's pretty good. Now, if you look on the other side of his organization, which is quite global, not so much. A lot is green. This is good, but they're not good at creative abrasion, and they're not good at creative resolution, that marketplace of ideas and making decisions. So let me show you, and I only want to show you one piece. I want us only to look at creative abrasion, because this is one of the things that I think is happening at GCI when people come together and try to work together from different nations, different points of view, etc. So creative abrasion. So first off, you see Michael's team is yellow. This is the organization, the whole organization. Again, it's global. It's hard to build a global culture and global capabilities. They have more diversity of thought than they used to. This is the second time we measured them. And they have it because they've actually broadened their global footprint. They've opened up in different countries. And they've also been bringing in new talent to do that digital transformation. And so they have more diversity. They also now have a place to do the marketplace of ideas. They have cross-functional and cross-geography teams. They were more siloed, but now they're working more in a team structure. Now you see what they're orange about is they're really bad at conflict and debate. Bad at it. And why are they bad at it? This is their report, and I deeply respect this people and are still studying them. They said to me, Linda, you know what? We're really polite people. We're nice. So we don't want to hurt anybody's feelings. And the second thing they said is we really, really, really respect expertise. So even though we're on a cross-functional team and we've been empowered to make a decision, we all look around and say, that decision falls more in Linda's area of expertise or whatever it is. So I'm going to let Linda make the decision because, she's the expert. And I don't want to hurt Linda's feelings because we're really talking about something that is her pet project. So what ended up happening over time is that these teams that were empowered weren't making decisions. Instead, they would escalate the decision up to senior management. And what you see there is the orange is right locus. The right people weren't in the room. And senior, why did this come back to us? We empowered you. Or right pace, they're moving too slowly because that's what happens when you escalate. And they weren't doing both and. They were not making any decisions, frankly. So one of the things that happened is a group of managers and individual contributors said, we can't stand this anymore. We have too many walking zombie projects. We got to fix it. And they began to work on culture. And the only thing I want to show you about the culture piece is that over time, if you look at what happened here, they were able, fortunately for us, by 2020, when they had to run those trials, they were able to fix creative abrasion. And one of the ways they did that is they basically had this project that they had at Pfizer all around called Straight Talk Coin. And if you didn't think people were saying what they should say, or were thinking, I should say, not what they should say, you could put that coin down and say, you know what, when you put that coin down, are we doing what patient X, arthritis patient, whatever, are we really talking about what we need to talk about? Because this is about delivering hope to an individual or a group of individuals. Dare we not say what we think? That was the Straight Talk Coin. There were lots of other pieces to this puzzle, but what I want to show you, and they tell me all the time, if they hadn't gotten better at creative abrasion, they could not have run these trials because they had to be able to really deal with conflict very quickly and efficiently, and they had to be able to make decisions, right, with creative resolution in a very urgent way because of what was happening. And as you all know, or maybe you don't know, every vial in that trial was exactly where it needed to be for them to run those trials in 266 days. Now you see shared purpose has gone down, and that's partly because they opened up other locations and they had to take time to build that shared purpose, et cetera. I find that it takes 4 to 5 years to actually build the kind of culture and capabilities you need to innovate over time, unless you're working, even if particularly in a big organization. In a small one, maybe not, but a big one, yes. One last thing that I want to do, and I'm aware of the time, I've talked longer than I wanted to talk, is that one of the things that Michael's group had to do, if that's Michael's group in the middle and that's Michael in the white dot, they didn't do this by themselves, Pfizer. They worked with a German biotech company. So the other thing you have to worry about is how do we build an organization or a team that can collaborate across our boundaries? We can collaborate with another organization so we can get done what we want to get done. So on the one hand, as a leader, you have to be an architect of your own culture and capabilities, but you got to do it in a way that you also know how to build bridges with other parties you're highly dependent on to get access to the tools, talent, or whatever it is, the resources you need to innovate and fulfill your purpose. And that's what we're talking about in Scaling Genius. So if I could, David, I'm going to go a little bit longer because I just want to tell the group one thing about this man, then I want to end. This is Vineet, and I met Vineet when he became the CEO of HCL Technologies. And he said to me, Linda, the whole future of this company is based on these young people. He called them young sparks. I'm not going to tell you their whole story. He wrote a whole book about it that's fabulous. He asked the young sparks, who do you want to be? This is who they wanted to be. That's what they wanted. And he said, okay, is this who you are? Mirror, mirror. They said, no, we're not this. Now, we would all want employees, colleagues who wanted to be this. So he said, it's going to take us about 5 years, but we're going to create the environment in which you will be allowed to be who you want to be. Your slice of genius will shine and contribute to what we're doing at HCL. And then you had, as a consequence of all of this, I'm just going to show you the result real quick. You had young people who were on the front line coming up with $15 million ideas for clients. No one in a million years thought something like this could happen, ever saw that front line as being capable of that. Now I'm going to jump ahead and tell you what he's doing now. Oh, this is one thing. If you do one of these things, you become an ideapreneur, as they call them. You get to work with a graphic artist to tell your story so that your story can be read by other young sparks to figure out how they can also do the same work. So this is an example of that. But I'm jumping ahead to this. So one of the things, what he's doing now, and this is what Vineet began to work on with his wife, Anupama, they actually said, you know, the problem in India is that people are not well educated. And it's not for the reason you think in some ways. They're not well educated because when you go to a school in India, you're taught that the teacher dictates and you simply repeat if you want to be an A+ student. Well, if that's the way you're taught, what ends up happening when you go to work is you think that if you're the manager, you got to dictate and make sure no one deviates. And the employee thinks, I better not deviate. Well, that doesn't lead to innovation. That doesn't create an environment in which people will share with you their talents and passions. So he took $100 million of the family wealth, he and his wife, I should say, for sure, it's family wealth. And they gave it to, they used it to work with government in a number of different states to improve education. So they said $100 million of our wealth. He came from a very poor village, never thought he would have this money or anything. And we're going to work with you, government, to improve education for these kids. So these are some of the kids they were working with and during COVID, actually. And here's a picture of children who live in even a better kind of space because there's actually electricity. There isn't in the first one. And what I want to tell you is he used the young sparks model, those same kinds of young sparks, to really change education, both the quality of what they're getting, started with English and math, but more importantly, this sort of critical thinking way, and it had to be very, very frugal. And I just want to show you, these are the states they worked in. And there's a whole model here. These are the results from actually, I apologize to you, I couldn't find the results. This is from about almost 2 years ago. And you can see 7 million children, $1 per child. They've been able to touch 90,000 schools, and the growth, the learning outcomes as measured by outsiders, not by them, 40%. And who has helped really drive this and been at the heart of managing government, teachers, et cetera? Young sparks, young people. So what we're trying to do at GCI is develop leaders and help young people understand, boy, you can make a difference. You are the difference. You are the future. What we do, and what I'm so proud of working with all of you, and this is not a sales job I've been asked to at all. This is why I love being a board member. What we know from a study of 4,000 plus executives we asked around the world, what do you need to be an effective leader today? These are the most important qualities. These are the most important qualities. And these are the qualities that I find, and why I'm so looking forward to going to Scotland in a month, that we are really trying to help young people figure out, have the opportunity to develop, because you can't teach people to lead, you can only give them experiences and help them and coach them along the way for them to develop these personal qualities themselves. So let me end there, and I went over too long. I apologize, but I definitely wanted to show you a little bit about Vineet and to remind us all that young people do change the world.
Well, Linda, thank you so much. That was exceptional. And I really appreciated that last slide. You know, one thing that stuck out as I'm getting to know, at least on paper, some of the students that are coming this summer is their incredible sense of curiosity. They're very interested in learning about other people, other worldviews. So that's very exciting. I want to first invite the audience to come in and write your questions down. We'll get to those in a second. I see there's a few already. And I want to ask you a question or two about leadership, Linda. But before I do, a sort of broad question. You said you're, an anthropologist. And, as you wrote this, Collective Genius, I sort of wonder, what surprised you? What the process of going in and studying all these different cultures must have led to some things that you did not expect to find. And I'm just curious, was there something that stuck out as, wow, that was really surprising. I didn't expect that.
Well, there are many things, but basically the main thing that stuck out was the main idea of the book, that it's not about vision, it's about creating an environment. So leadership, I am a protege of John Kotter and Warren Bennis, who taught us all about the distinction between leadership and management. And leadership is about having a vision, communicating that vision, and motivating people to want to fulfill that vision. Turns out innovation is not about that. And it's more about this creation of an environment. And part of it is because you cannot tell people to innovate. You can only invite them. They have to want to do it and be willing and able to do it. The able is not easy. Neither is the willing, it turns out. So in many of our organizations, even though our rhetoric is we want to hear what you think, our behavior as leaders doesn't necessarily lead them to do that. So what really, I think just the basic premise was, I was sort of like, wait a minute, vision is what leadership is all about. And they're like, no, not if you're trying to innovate. Part of that is because you actually don't have a vision, as many of them told me. I mean, I remember, well, if it's breakthrough, you don't actually know the answer. So you don't have that to get people to follow. What you do know is the problem. So at Procter & Gamble, what Kathy Fish would say is fall in love with the problem of the customer. Don't fall in love with your solution. What's your purpose? Who are we serving? Fall in love with their world. And then you're going to be you're innovating on behalf of them and their world, their point of view, even though we all have tons of solutions, right, in our heads or whatever that we'd like to see be implemented. That's not what should drive our decision-making. Yeah. And our actions, if you will. Yep.
Very interesting. And that was something I was really captivated with in your book, Collective Genius. There's this sort of notion that has existed for a long time, which you just described, that the leader is a sole visionary, comes up with all these ideas and then tries to get people to march forward and bring that to life. And I love you use the term jazz a lot. How you know the role of the leader is actually to create a context where everyone can play their instrument, in this case, bring certain ideas forward and those slices of genius, and then you integrate them. So I thought that was a very interesting insight.
And the integration happens with that creative resolution. I think the thing is, I didn't show this because it's all too complicated in some ways. We actually know what dimensions of a leader's style make a difference relative to creating those capabilities. So what it is you as a leader need to learn how to be pretty versatile in your behavior, because you got to figure out, do we need to be improvising now, or do we need to be more structured? Am I going to really encourage bottom-up behavior, or is it time to do top-down behavior? So Vineet used to say, sometimes, Linda, I'm using brute force because that's what we need, right? Because something's urgent or whatever it is. So you as a leader want to be versatile in your behaviors and your capacity to read a team's dynamic and say, at this moment, they need me to be supportive, or no, now we need to have a little more confrontation. So that is what makes leadership so hard. There isn't one right answer. And part of the problem is we all have preferences on some of these dimensions. So some of us find it much easier to work. One of the most common ones for very senior people is people prefer to deal with conflict one-on-one, not in a group. So what you'll often see is we'll meet with everybody before the meeting. And then when we get to the meeting, the group doesn't get to do real work because you've already done the work before you get there. And that's about your own incapacity as a leader to deal with conflict, right? Not because that's the right way to do it. Now, there are contexts in which you should do things one-on-one, but I cannot tell you how often very senior executives will say to me, I meet with all my team members before. So by the time we get there, everybody knows what's going to happen. And I was like, well, you're not getting the advantage of creative abrasion. You're hearing it and they're abrading with you, but that's different from a group meeting and discussing together and knowing how to, do the exchange, the listening, etc. Actually, the CEO of Procter & Gamble at the time, he ended up hiring a coach, or they ended up hiring a coach for the C-suite. And the C-suite was basically given a measure on how often they made a statement and how often they asked a question. Very micro behaviors were making a difference in how, imagine the people who are presenting to them, they're pretty senior people who didn't feel safe and who knew pretty quickly which answer was supposed to be the right one, right? And stopped saying what they really thought was the right one, if you will. So I think those are examples of why it's so hard. There's not one right answer. You have to be able to read the dynamic and make adjustments.
Right. And I find, you present in Collective Genius these different paradoxes, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which are really fascinating to think through. On one hand, there needs to be organizational structure, but it can't be so rigid that it doesn't allow innovation. And you can't have no structure because that leads to chaos.
Mm-hmm.
And same thing, I think, with this, creative abrasion, you need that kind of tension. You need different ideas to come together, but at the same time have to create a context where, people themselves feel safe. These are more about ideas, and there's a shared purpose to really try to move the organization forward. It's not about, just what the individual feels.
And one of the things I should say, so purpose is what we align around. Because when I first heard this, surprised me when everyone kept saying to me, these are really, really innovative teams, organizations, et cetera. It's not about vision. Now, what you have to be able to do as a leader is you actually have to be able to lead change and lead innovation. So once you get the answer, if you will, then, you change your behavior to be more like, this is the vision, this is what we're doing. So you need to be able to do both. And I think that's an important thing to keep in mind about it. But I do, so, you have to have a way of thinking about leadership that allows for both. But again, it's you figuring out, and you don't have to do it by yourself. This is why it's important to have an effective team. And the research tells us that those leaders who can't build effective teams are derailing very fast in our current environment, which is very dynamic and very complex. So this is not all by yourself. I want to be clear. One of the leaders we studied, the CEO of Cleveland Clinic Abu Dhabi, he said two things I had to do to function effectively, because just think of the nationalities in that hospital. I think there are about 90 of them. And one of the things he said was, I had to find a sparring partner who was different than me, who actually had a completely, he's an optimist apparently. So he wanted a pessimist and someone who played on one of those sides of those paradoxes and the others. He also went to his senior team and said, and he's a surgeon, he's a pioneer in robotic cardiac surgery. He went to the team and said, this is a sacred space. And during COVID, he would go around the room and ask everybody on a scale from 1 to 10, how are you feeling today? This is a surgeon. I'm making fun of surgeons. My husband's a physician. And he said, how are you feeling today? What? How am I feeling today? Which is not something that most senior teams talk about. And 5,000 people in this very big hospital. And so, he said on a scale from 1 to 10, well, initially everybody was feeling a 10, I'm a 9 maybe. But then they got honest and said, sacred space, actually, today I'm feeling like a 3 or a 4. Guess what? Someone on my team died of COVID. And he said, we need to know that because your thinking is clouded. You're in pain. So we all need to be helpful. So I think that what we see happening, and that wasn't natural for him. He talked about, he had to, he got coaches too to help him think through and to lead virtually on one of these cameras. He got someone to help him figure out, how am I perceived if I lean closer to the camera, or if I lean back, or if I make this face, what happens? So again, he understood that everything about who he was a part of his leadership and was working hard. And this man is a Rhodes Scholar, so a real smart guy, right? And he just knew, I need help. I don't know how to handle this circumstance. It's different.
Right.
And his sparring partner at the end of the day would give him feedback on how he did.
That's outstanding. Linda, there are so many questions from the audience. So
Yes.
Even though I have many, I'm going to turn to the audience questions and go through some of those. So the first one here from Wyatt is a question on creative resolution. If patience is so heavily emphasized, how severe of a downside is the potential loss of the advantages of first movers and fast followers?
So I'm talking about patience in the sense of when you are making a decision in a meeting about something. One of the things we're really writing about in Scaling Genius is how do you take an idea, execute it at scale with speed. Speed is so important in our environment, but sometimes, as I forget what the book is called, you have to move slow to move fast. Well, I will tell you that once you practice doing both it goes much, much faster. So you get better at it. And actually, as I said, if you think about Michael's group, they couldn't really even make a decision or deal with conflict. But imagine how fast and actually right they had to be to do the trials. So they had a few years to practice, as you saw, from 2017 to 2020. And if they hadn't had that practice, they would not have been so fast. Because the crisis doesn't teach you how to do those kinds of things properly, right? You have to practice, and you'll discover if you really get good at it as a team, you're real fast at it. It doesn't take you a lot of time, but it does require going through a lot of cycles. And this little group that came together they created training programs for all of them to get faster at decision making with regulated environment where they could not in any way sacrifice quality or safety.
Well, thank you for that. There's a question here from one of our new fellows that you will get to meet in Scotland, Wabi. And Wabi asks, what advice you would give for fellows who are still trying to figure out their projects for GCI? So let me give a little bit of background on this for those who don't know what that question is about. Every fellow who enters GCI engages in a global service project. They choose an issue locally they're passionate about that resonates with the global, and they work on that, try to refine it and pitch it at the end of their time in Scotland. But then they spend a solid 10 months after their time with us in person, working with a mentor to refine that and build that. And they're all in different stages right now of thinking through their project. So any advice, Linda, to our fellow on thinking about a project?
I hope it's tied to it needs to be tied to something that matters, if you will. So think about the purpose. What is your purpose? Who do you intend to serve? Why is the question you're looking at important, and to whom? So understand that piece of the puzzle. And I think what you also want to do, and I didn't show it so much, but one of the things you see about organizations that are very innovative is people are very bold. They are going after coulds that are a stretch. Because the other thing that I hear is it really worth it to go do all this work just to get that? I mean, what? So think about the could, not this, and it may be that there's a should that needs to be addressed, however, given the area that you're interested in, and it might take innovation to deliver that. So what Vineet used to say to the young Sparks, you have to deliver the contract. You must deliver the should, but always think about how you can go beyond the contract and therefore delight that stakeholder or that customer that you're working with. So I think whatever it is, stretch yourself a little bit more, be a little bolder. But then the other thing I'd really say, which is, who are you really going to be dependent on to deliver on that? And think about something that's manageable for you to get done, even though it's bold, right? And how much, how long is it going to take you to build those relationships with the relevant parties to actually be able to deliver that? Because mostly you're going to have to do it, I presume, whatever it is, with others, and maybe across sectors or whatever. So I think that define your project, something that, be bold about it. And maybe though, for this first 10 months, you're only going to reach a certain milestone of something that really is a multi-year project, because that's the nature of what you're trying to get done. So I think kind of on the one hand, be realistic and pragmatic about who the parties are that you've got to impact, who you're really going to be dependent on to deliver that purpose that you care about, that could, and then, or if it's a should, because the shoulds need to be taken care of too. And then, maybe I'm not going to get everything done in the year. But by the end of the year, this is my milestone that I want to reach. And then I'm going to have to continue to work on this, maybe, I don't know, for another year. So Vineet, obviously changing primary education in India, $100 million is a drop in the bucket. 5 years, drop in the bucket, the millions of children who need to have access to better education. But he's got his 5-year mark, and he's got what he hopes will happen after that he's catalyzing, that government and teachers will take forward.
Well, great advice, Linda. So Wabi, I hope that was helpful to you and to other new fellows who are on the Zoom with us today. And you'll get to, those new fellows will get to meet Linda in person. So we're all here to help you with your projects. Next question is from Paul. And Paul says, Dr. Hill, you use the word creative throughout your research framework. Can you talk about creativity and the relationship between creativity and innovation? How do you foster creativity in people?
So the way in our framework, and I actually have worked with, all of us are more creative than we think, okay? Because these are all loaded words. And even though I described innovation very broadly, inevitably people think about product innovation or whatever. They don't think about, if you create new packaging, that's actually an innovation. So first off, I really want to go back to that definition of what innovation is. And so in terms of creativity, for me, the creative is the new. And many of us have, new ideas. And again, some of that creativity might be more incremental than breakthrough. Again, we think about, I happen to study Pixar and the Steve Jobs, one of his organizations, but we think about that. So think about those young sparks and all the innovative solutions they're coming up with to help those teachers deliver to kids where there's no electricity, where there's no money, and they got to help those teachers teach those kids that I showed you a picture of during COVID. So one of the first things that they had to innovate on, and I can't even I'm trying to remember exactly how it happened, is they decided that they wanted children to be seen as students and not workers. And you can imagine in India, in these villages, that the families needed those children to go out into the field or go out somewhere and do work to help bring food and resource to the family. So the first innovation they had to come up with is ways to get the families to put the children in their uniforms every day. Even if just put the uniform on. And the young sparks came up with that. We got to get them to put those uniforms on so that when the child is in that uniform, the family sees this is a child who's a student, because they were very worried that a whole generation of children would never get educated because of the costs. Because of what's happening there. Now, they innovated a lot and came up with incentives to get the parents to put those uniforms on those children. Now, that may not seem, that's creative. To frame the problem that way, think about it. Wait, how do we make sure they're not seen as workers? They're seen as students. You see them out on the path. They used the various religious institutions, whether, there are different religions in these villages. And so they had to think of, well, how are we going to educate them when we don't have anything? They gave the teachers WhatsApp. This is because it was recently, and the teachers were developing curriculum that could be used in that context on WhatsApp and sharing it across the country on WhatsApp. So that may not sound so innovative to you that you realize we can create a community of teachers on WhatsApp. The teachers had never used WhatsApp. They didn't know what that was. They now are generating their own curriculum that fits their village, their language, their circumstances. So again, I would call these are all creative ideas that are changing the lives of children and are coming from young sparks. It turns out that the young sparks, they hired the wrong people initially. They went to the major universities, or the top ones, and asked people to become involved. And many people wanted to, like our Teach for America. But those people really found being in those villages very, very hard. Yeah. And so they went to the villages instead and began to recruit the young sparks from the villages who had been educated, who had gone to college. They were deeply committed. And so I don't know if you would call those creative ideas or not, but as far as I'm concerned, to understand the problem that way, we have to make sure they're seen as students and come up with incentives to get parents to dress them. And, the WhatsApp, and I have to show you all the kinds of things they put on WhatsApp to help the teachers learn it quickly and develop materials. So that to me is creativity. But then the question is, not only were they creative, it was useful because they executed it. They got the teachers to do it.
Right. Execution, very, very important piece. Well, sort of building on that, there's a question from Kate here. Thank you so much for sharing these fascinating insights, Dr. Hill. Can you share additional examples of ways to deepen a team's ability to foster and work through and with creative abrasion? It's such an interesting term, Kate ends with.
Yeah, creative abrasion is the big one for many leaders, teams, organizations. There are many examples. I'm trying to think of, well, I'm going to use an extreme one that I don't think you really should do, but I'm using it to illustrate a point. So I was in Japan with Yumi, as a matter of fact, in GCI. I don't know when that was, before COVID, a few years back. And one of the people that we interviewed was the man who was the former chairperson of Sony. And he said the following that I think made most of us fall off our chairs. He described, and I can say it because it was a public meeting with maybe 400 plus people there. He said, you know what? I began to realize that everyone thought I was supposed to have the answers. That's the way we think of leadership. You're the visionary, et cetera. And I realized I had this team of people, these very senior executives with me, and they were just, they were waiting for me to say what we were going to do. Well, that wasn't good enough because Sony wasn't delivering what it needed to deliver. So one day he went in apparently and he said what he thought. He was thinking this in his head, I guess. He said what he thought they should do about something. And the first person who spoke said, I agree with you, chairperson, right, son, because that's what you would do in Japan. And so he doesn't, I don't think he could believe, I don't know if he could believe it or not, but what he said to that person was, you know what, I know you're a very busy person. I'm paraphrasing a bit. I know you're a very busy person. If you agree with me, I already know what you think. So you can go back to work. You don't need to stay at the meeting. Now you can only imagine anywhere in the world for the CEO to tell you you can leave the meeting and go back to work. And he said it politely. It wasn't anything. And then he ended up saying to the team, I'm not going to speak for the first 20 minutes. I'm just not. So we can sit here quietly because we have to break the habit of me being the one who, and he had to break the habit of him being the one who filled up the space and said, this is what we're going to do. Just like that CEO at Procter & Gamble, am I making statements or am I asking questions? How do I engage all of the genius in this room to do what we need to do? So I don't know that I would say to somebody, I know what you think already, but what leaders often learn to do over time is to speak last, which is really hard. It turns out that stars have more trouble learning to lead. That's a whole nother conversation because you have so many ideas, you have so many potential answers. But I think that, this idea of two things actually that Michael Koo. One is he kept talking about change, innovation. Well, these people were exhausted. They'd had lots of mergers, acquisitions, outsourcing. Finally, someone said to him, can you just use the word evolution? Must we always be changing and innovating? We're evolving. If there's something about that word that feels better. So his rhetoric mattered. He changed it. He said, we're evolving. The second thing he said, he got feedback because he can take up all the space because he has a million ideas too, and he's energetic and all of that. He spoke last. He realized that he was taking up, and then he did turn taking because everyone didn't speak English as a first language. It really was a matter of silence was being treated as if it was agreement instead of making the space. Rules against interruption so people could get their ideas out. So it's often not big stuff, it's micro stuff so that you can match your intent with your impact.
Small things matter. Yeah, very interesting. There's a sort of related question that builds on this a bit from John. Dr. Hill, you spoke about versatility and leadership. What do you think is his best method a leader should use to get the best out of his or her workers, using brute force or being soft?
Well, as I said, I never use the word soft, but anyway, so I use the word support. So let me just be clear about that, because sometimes the way you support someone is being a little tough, right? So I just want to separate these out. As David said, and I didn't work through all of them with you, there are these 6 paradoxes that have to be managed, where you need to be sort of really versatile if you want to build an organization that's more innovative. So what I would say about it is, how do you become more versatile? So this is the theory. The theory is, in theory, the most effective leaders have no preferences. Because if you have no preferences, you're going to read the situation, read the person, and adapt your behavior to what that person needs at that moment. And one of the things we know as new managers, if you recall, I used to do research on new managers, is we have to learn that to treat people fairly is to treat people differently. Because people need and want different things from us, and we have to be able to adapt to that. So one of the things we see is that in theory, we all need to be versatile and able to adapt, to read the situation, which is about empathy and capacity to read what the dynamics are of the group or the organization, and then adjust your behavior. So you can get better at that with practice. Like empathy can be learned. You really can practice and get better at empathy, stepping into the shoes of the other. And then you need to be able to adapt your behavior. So let me give you an extreme example. I don't know if it's that extreme. So there was a Harvard MBA, one of my former students, very extroverted, really, really capable, CEO of a company. I'm talking about CEOs here, of a startup, right? And she has money from the founder of Netflix as one of her major investors in her business. Okay, all well and good. It's a tech business. Turns out one day, the head of her IT group came to her and said, I don't know if you've noticed but I'm not really shaping our IT strategy. I think it was called their digital strategy, actually, because I'm not speaking in the meetings. You're so fast that before I even get my thoughts collected, we've moved on to another decision. So he said, you're not hearing from me. And she said, what do you mean I'm not hearing from you? You're in the meeting. You know what? Why? How do we make that decision about something that he said, you made it. I didn't speak. So she looked at her own energy, et cetera, and realized this might be a problem. So at the next town hall, she actually said, so-and-so came to me. It wasn't, and said that this is what's happening. We're not using, and he's the head of the group. How many of you feel that way? Hands went up everywhere. And they all started reading the book Quiet, which is about introversion and how you work with that. And they began to redesign the way they did the meetings to fit, to allow to hear the voices of people who were not so extroverted as her. And that was not easy for her. I mean, she slipped many times, but again, she realized, what do you mean? I'm not hearing from the head of digital because he's introverted and my style is actually overwhelming him. Again, so I think that's one, being aware. And she couldn't have been aware actually in some ways unless he had told her. And that was brave to tell her. Although we should be reading and being detectives and trying to understand or looking back at who did speak and how did we make this decision. But he was bold enough, he was brave enough to tell the boss, no. And then she publicly made a commitment. So there was public accountability. Okay, we're going to do things differently in this company. So we all with different styles will be able to participate fully and share, in my language, a slice of genius. And so that meant not assuming that quiet was agreement or that you'd heard from that party. So this is where you have to, it's a skill set, and you want people to trust you enough to tell you when you're actually getting in the way of fulfilling your purpose because of your own behavior.
Absolutely. Well, we have about a minute left because we do want to end promptly. So I'm just going to read two things in the chat to you, Linda, so you're aware of them, and then ask you one last question. So Yumi says, yes, Kaz Hirai was the former Sony president who was with the Global Forum. That was back in 2019. And Paul Hastings writes in the chat, quote, leaders learn over time to speak last, unquote, which is what you said. And he says he loves that. So people are learning from you a lot today, Linda. Thank you. Last question, which, a question I wanted to raise, but I'm going to let Masa Fuji, a colleague who is in Japan, ask it. He says, how do we leverage the GCI alumni, the leaders that we've created, to make the world a better place? And I'll just add on top of that, if you have any messages you want to send to the fellows and alumni that are with us today, please feel free to do that.
Well, this is an instance in which I think I should talk last, because I'm sure you all have many ideas about that. I would say that there is power in the collective. So it's very important that we figure out how the alums, in fact, collectively can have an impact on moving forward the mission and the purpose of this organization, because we're all quite committed to it. So I think we need to have a session where you sort of, you look at that in some depth. It has to be tied to, what do you feel like you need to help you do what you want to do? And you all can think about that. I mean, one thing that I know, And it's not about money. One of the groups at Harvard Business School that I work with, what they do, the alums, they actually have a group, kind of their own WhatsApp kind of group, and you put in your question or your request for certain resources or help. And, you know, because and people see those and they respond to it. In some instances, in my instance, it might be money, it might be expertise, or it might be a network. Can you connect me to these people? So they actually do have a space where you can write in your request, and other people will respond to that, you know, and tell you, yes, I can do this or not do that. So that's one thing. But I think that I really would trust more the creative abrasion of the group to get together and figure out what ways do you want to, what could you be doing, not just should, and be bold about it.
Excellent advice. Well, it is 10 a.m. here on the East Coast, and we want to end promptly. But with that, let me say thank you, Linda. Thank you so much for such an incredible, insightful talk. I know I learned a lot, and I think the fellows, alumni, supporters of GCI, everyone that was here learned a tremendous amount. Today's webinar is recorded, so you can share this with others. And I do want to let everyone know that our next GCI talks will be in October 19th, and feature Dr. Hiroyuki Fujita, who is president and CEO of QED, Quality Electrodynamics, and also of Canon Medical USA. So please stay tuned for that. But Linda, thank you so much for being with us. Thanks for being one of our leaders here. And thanks for helping us learn and grow. Truly appreciate it.
Well, thank you. It's really my privilege. It's a blessing to have this opportunity. And see you soon, those of you who are going to be in Scotland.
Thanks so much. Thanks, everyone, for joining us. Have a great day. Take care.